Welcome back, everyone. We're halfway through the class. This is so exciting for me. It's good to see all of you here. So last week I gave you a homework assignment, and I don't, they're not required, but was anybody able to work on it? Yeah, all right. And so if anybody wants to share how it felt to do it, you don't have to share anything personal if you don't want to. But raise your hand, we'll unmute you, Karina. So I think you can unmute yourself now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I sure can.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Initially I was really nervous and anxious about it. I have a whole bunch of stuff written down, so I'm not going to share it all, but
Yeah.
I think some of the important things were Michael made it a lot easier because he shared some of his things that were vulnerable for him. So that made me feel safer to be able to share some of my vulnerabilities. And then I think one of the questions was there any surprises? And I think it shouldn't be a surprise, but the surprise is that there's just still so much work to do. Like I've been doing work for so long and I've come so far, and then I just feel like there's still so much work to do. Like you think you've touched on these little areas and you've put salve on these little wounds, or you've stitched them back together again, and you put those shoulders back, you've dusted stuff off, and you've looked at it, you've addressed it, you've loved it, and then there's something else. So
Yeah.
I think that was one of my biggest, it was a surprise but not a surprise. And then finally, I hate to say it, but it's the truth. Mom. Mom is where it most of it was learned from. And she is a person who she has a very, or did I write down, not enoughness mentality. So if you boil everything down, if you boil down feelings of jealousy or not being attractive enough or feeling of insecurity, it all boils down to not enoughness. And so I think that was something I sat with for a while, and I'm still working through. So those are some of my.
What a fantastic job with the homework assignment. I couldn't ask for it to be done any differently. And if you guys did do it differently, that's probably just as fantastic. So the first part about Michael sharing and that made it easier is a great example of why it's important to choose the right people to do your work with, right? So when you find a therapist to work with, it's got to be somebody that you can find that emotional attunement with. Or when you're working on it with some friends, you need to be particular about it, because some people are not going to meet your words with empathy. And if you're sharing anything that has to do with shame and it's not met with empathy, the shame is going to grow. And that's no fault of your own. It's just how shame works. If it's met with empathy, the shame dies, at least for that moment, right? So it can't survive when it's met with empathy. So that's a reinforcement of how important it is to be careful and mindful of who we choose to share our story with. And the part about it not being done yet, gosh, I think I was just talking about that with Michael last night. And we're never done. We are never done. But the point is that we keep trying, right? And it can be so frustrating when you think you've done, you've done all of this work, and then you find yourself right back in a spot that you were there before. But I believe that that is intentional, right? So we're supposed to go in a spiral. It's not linear healing. It's like this. And so each time you come around to that spot, you're going to have more wisdom because you have grown. You have a different set of eyes to look at it, and then you're going to process it as that version of Karina, who has more wisdom and knowledge because of the work you're doing. And then you're going to go around, and then next thing you know, you'll be back there again, and you do another layer each time, and you have a different set of eyes each time. And that's what life is, and that's what this journey is. And So it's easy to, you know, that can create shame when you find yourself back in that spot again, and frustration, and kind of beat yourself up sometimes. Like, you know, I thought I did all the work, but I guess I didn't do it, or any type of negative self-talk can pop up. So I hope that you can kind of remind yourself, like, no, it's supposed to be like this, even though it feels crappy, it's okay. I'm in the right spot. I think I'm going to be circling around through this relationship stuff until I die.
Me too.
But, you know, each time I do it, I feel like I have a better perspective on it. And I tend to bounce back in a different way. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any feedback on the homework? You don't have to, but if you want to, you can. All right, Carolyn, I think you can unmute.
Hi. Yeah, the first part about sharing with the group last week, yeah, it was uncomfortable at first. I went ahead and volunteered to go first. And I think I probably shared in layers. You know, I shared high level, then they were great about, you know, chiming in. And so then I was comfortable to share more. So I was really happy with how that part went. As far as, you know, looking at some of my thought traps, I would say, yeah, some come from my upbringing and my parenting, you know, the parents that I had, of course. And I would say some of it, though, some of my not enoughness comes from reading all sorts of, you know, magazines directed at women as a young person.
Oh, yeah.
You know, like my sister would always bring home Cosmopolitan, and other magazines like that tell you how to do your hair right and dress right to catch Mr. Right, and all the things you can do differently and change about yourself to, you know, get Mr. Right. That was really part of my history. And I think it fed into my own insecurities of you know, already not feeling like enough. You know, if I had been feeling like I was enough when I read those articles, I probably would have said, "Oh, this is baloney. Why am I even looking at this magazine?" But you know, I you know, recognize that, you know, my mom was probably like me, an anxious attachment style. Dad was probably like most of the men I've had longer term relationships with a more of a fearful attachment style. And you know, it was always, you know, regardless of the fact that I was a really great student and really well behaved, you know, it was never enough, you know. And the one time I came home as a senior in high school after my curfew, you would have thought that I committed murder. And I was like, really? Like, well, why don't I just always misbehave? And then you would be happy if I came in 10 minutes late, you know? So yeah, it was a good reflection. On the positive side, while there is more work to do, you know, when I went back and reflected at the quiz, I feel like I have made progress, you know, over the course of my life. And one of the big areas I feel like I made progress in is in that delusional area. In earlier relationships, I thought that I had any impact on somebody changing. Again, you know, the right things. You know, if I was enough, then he would be better. And at least now I'll say to friends like, nope, not looking for a fixer-upper project. You know, and at least not anyone that's more of a fixer-upper than me. And you know, someone that's working on it. There's still aspects to that I'm working on, but certainly not as to the degree that I was in my younger years.
Oh, that's awesome. I really love you talking about like the social influence of the pressure that, you know, I haven't even made that connection to this subject, but God, you're spot on. And not
Oh,
feeling
it's,
enough.
yeah, I mean, it's,
Way back with 17 magazine, you know,
oh,
and I
yeah.
never looked like anybody on there, and I never looked like anybody that was on TV. And that's any girl magazine was all about looks.
Yep. Yep. And how you should act and what you should say to catch him.
Yes.
I mean, and it goes back even, you know, at an earlier level in our culture, when you think about movies, you know, it came out when my kids were young, not when I was young, but movies like Beauty and the Beast. If she just loved the Beast enough, you know, then, you know, and she, you know, then he would become a prince. But it was all up to her loving him enough, right?
Oh my gosh, isn't that
You
the
know,
story of my life?
right? And so, and I've used that analogy with friends in bad relationship. I'm like, you're in a Beauty and the Beast relationship. And they're like, what? And I'm like, doesn't matter how much you love him, you know, he's not going to change.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. You can recognize that now, you know, and you know, the whole comment about a fixer-upper, I mean, technically we're all fixer-uppers, but we don't want to be the one having to do all the fixing.
Right.
Fixing out for someone else. If they're working on it and we're working on ours, then that's a different story, right?
I'll help you work on yours and you help me work on mine, but you know, I'm not into like, I'm gonna, no, not trying to fix anybody these days.
Right. Awesome. Thank you, Carolyn. Anybody else feel like sharing, or do we want to get started on the class?
There are a couple of comments in the box.
Okay.
Shawneen said, I love that visual of the spiral. And Michael
Yeah.
said, yes, Shawneen, it's a circular process. We keep coming back around.
Yeah, man, that's so true. My first therapist taught me that, because I can remember sitting there saying, but I already worked on my mom. You know, I already processed my mother. And she said, you processed a piece of your mother. I was like, damn it. You mean there's more than one piece? And she's like, yeah, it's around. And I'm like, it was deflating to hear that at first, but then it was kind of validating because it released my frustration. And it just, over the course of these years, I realized that this is just something I'm doing for the rest of my life. All right, so let me share my screen. We are on week 3. Can't believe it. So now that we have unpacked the basics of attachment theory, as well as the 4 different attachment styles, and we've learned in depth about the anxious attachment style, let's dig into what relationships really look like when you match up 2 people with different attachment styles. We'll start with the secure relationships. So we've already learned that those with secure attachment styles approach their unions with trust and ease. So it makes sense that they'll tend to pair up with other secure attachers, seemingly living happily ever after. Of course, there's a lot more to successful relationships than attachment styles, but that is a class for another day. They don't always pair up with other secure attachers. So you will find a secure attacher with an anxious or with a fearful avoidant. Sometimes, you know, I know that it exists, and they're probably a good match for them because they have the patience to deal with all of the triggers. But for the most part, secure people attach up with, pair up with other secure people. So the dismissive avoidant attachers, we've already learned that they keep their relationships at surface level only. So it makes sense that when they do happen to pair up with someone, it's typically with another dismissive avoidant or with those who are unavailable for commitment for other reasons. Or they might not pair up at all and just keep everything casual. If they don't do that, then the relationship is likely to end quickly, as they will simply walk away once conflict arises. Like I said, when we reviewed them the first week, there's not a lot for me to say about this demographic in here because they're not interested in changing the outcome of their relationships. They like this relationship pattern, which is basically not having them. So I don't really spend a lot of time on them because I'm not quite sure what else to say. So what are we left with in the dating pool? It's the anxiously attached and the fearfully avoidant attached. Those are the ones that are left after the secure people pair up and the dismissive people go on their own. We are the ones that are left. The pairing up of two fearful avoidants is difficult because both of them are going to need their space, which leaves no one left to maintain the attempts at intimacy. The pairing up of two anxious attachers is possible, but it's not common, just because they're often not attracted to each other. Remember, the anxiously attached, which is us, are perpetuating the cycle of unlovability and abandonment. So choosing a clingy mate would actually force them to freely accept love, which in reality is too scary and vulnerable for them. Underneath their intense desire for intimacy actually lies a fear of intimacy. This is why those who will freely love the anxious attacher spark no interest or chemistry. And I know that that sounds counterintuitive because we are the ones that are craving all of this intimacy. But if you remember, we're craving it with people who won't give it to us. And the people who will freely give us everything we want, we tend to find them boring. Okay, and this can be a hard one to grasp. So just, if you can't understand it right now, just keep it in the back of your head, okay? But the reason we are choosing these people is because we have our own fear of intimacy. Now, it was really hard for me to figure that one out because I kept labeling my boyfriends as those ones with the fear of intimacy, which was also true. And I'm like, no, I want it. I have a lot of emotions and I'm ready for love. I just want to be loved. I just want to be loved, but not by people who could love me. So this means that most anxious attachers will inevitably find themselves paired up with a fearful avoidant. I'm sure you can all agree with me on that. The reason this occurs is because they both satisfy each other's dysfunctional needs, each one triggering the other's attachment response. This pairing is one of the most common types of dysfunctional relationships, as our brains are more comfortable with what is familiar than with what is pleasant. Humans are inclined to pair up with those who confirm our pre-existing beliefs about relationships, whether those beliefs are faulty or not. And I know this might sound confusing because these people are craving the opposite of what they're attracted to. So let's unpack this idea a little bit more. As human beings, after we have formed a view, we tend to embrace information that confirms that view while ignoring or rejecting information that casts doubts on that view. Think about the people who ignore red flags in relationships. Though not the only reason, confirmation bias is a big reason why this happens. The theory of confirmation bias suggests that we don't perceive circumstances objectively. Rather, we cherry pick out the pieces of data that make us feel good, because those pieces confirm our prejudices. Essentially, this results in making us prisoners of our own false theories. And we have no idea that this is what we are doing our entire lives. Do we have any questions, Kathy, on that? This is a big chunk of confusion here.
We do. Carolyn is asking, slide 5, are we talking about fearful avoidant?
Right, we're talking, well, on the first line, we're talking about how, let's see. No, we're talking about both. We're talking about both. So this is the fearful avoidant and the anxious. So the interesting thing about both of these styles is, though they behave differently, the reasoning behind the behavior is the same. Is there another question, Kathy?
Carolyn wants a little clarification as opposed to dismissive avoidant.
Right. So, you know, dismissive avoidance have the same confirmation bias. I'm not talking about them right now because we're rarely in relationships with them. This segment is about the anxious avoidant relationship. And yes, dismissives, they have their own confirmation bias that they're independent, that they don't want to be tied down, that they don't need relationships, that they don't need to feel emotions, that they don't crave intimacy, and they cherry pick everything out of all of that to whatever, you know, reaffirms those beliefs for them. So all of the insecure attachment styles do these things. But specifically right now, we're talking about the anxious and avoidant. I hope that clears it up.
She did say she was confused because the word avoidant is used in multiple ways.
Okay, yeah. So, you know, and the very first class, I talked about how the names of each style has changed over the years, and they're changed now. Some people only say there's 3 styles. They'll say there's secure, preoccupied, or disorganized and avoidant. It's really interesting. If you Google this, you're going to get even more confused because they'll just label the dismissive avoidant as avoidant. And they'll label one as anxious and another as disorganized. But sometimes they'll call the anxious ambiguous. So yeah, it is confusing. And in reality, all of in some way, all of us that are not secure are avoidant. Even though us anxious ones are more anxious, we're still avoiding healthy relationships. So hopefully I'm clearing some of that up for you. Let me know if I'm not, because I don't want to move on if you're not on the same page.
She says we can move on.
Okay, yeah. All right, so how does confirmation bias affect this type of relationship, the anxious avoidant relationship? Well, in a nutshell, badly. Confirmation bias causes anxious attachers to choose avoidant partners because of the dismissive behavior. That's right, they choose partners who they know will not give them what they want. This is what makes them cling to them like life rafts. And when you're clinging to something, you never have to surrender. We'll explain more of that as we get into this. Surrendering to the unknown, which is for us, freely accepting love without knowing what will happen, is super scary for those who have anxiety. Also, this scenario allows them to place the blame of the failure of the relationship on their avoidant partner, as opposed to taking the chance that they might be rejected once they are seen for who they really are, which they fear might be unworthiness or not enough. Of course, they inevitably feel rejected despite all of these subconscious efforts not to. Do we have any questions on that? Okay. This is convoluted and messy, right? I know it is, but that's exactly why it's so difficult to change these patterns. Our brains are really, really good at hiding the answers from us because our brains like what is familiar. Remember this as we go along. Our goal with this course is to learn to challenge what is familiar and choose what is scary. It's the opposite of what our gut tells us to do. But this is how we rewrite these patterns. There is no reward without vulnerability. Sorry, I can't speak tonight. I find this whole page right here is just so juicy and revealing and confusing all at the same time. So I'm sure we'll have lots of questions later on and lots, maybe even after the class, once your brain starts chewing on this. So in the same way, the fearful avoidant likes to pair with the anxiously attached because they know this mate will make them feel smothered. Because to them, this confirms what a relationship looks and feels like. This is their confirmation bias. Kathy, do we have some questions?
We had a couple of comments. Janine said, wow, that's a powerful, when we cling to someone, we never have to surrender. Wow, so true. And Carolyn reacted with a thumb.
Yeah, yeah. This was like, it took me a couple of times of hearing this for me to actually acknowledge that this is what was happening with me, because I was so learned on the emotionally unavailable man and why they're behaving this way, and that's making me feel the way I am. And I started this whole process, honestly, of learning about this stuff because I was researching how to make an emotionally unavailable man available. Like how to make these relationships work. And when I had to look at myself as being emotionally unavailable and afraid of commitment, it didn't make any sense because I had tricked myself into thinking that's what I really wanted. But you know, that's vulnerable shit right there, and that's scary. So it makes sense that I'm going to pick somebody who's not going to give it to me, because if I know subconsciously that I'm not going to get it, then maybe I'm not going to feel disappointed, or, you know, who knows? Our brain does all of these things to kind of hijack us. So additionally, most fearful avoidants are aware that they contain this profound inner struggle of simultaneously craving and fearing intimacy, but they have a very difficult time trying to control those conflicting emotions. They can swing like a pendulum, exhibiting explosive emotions one minute and then locking them down the next. So when these people join together, the fearful avoidant and the anxiously attached, they become entangled in a painful dance of disconnection, with one partner chasing, which is the anxious, while the other partner is running away, which is the avoidant. So if you always feel like you're chasing or that you're being chased, then you're likely caught up in the anxious avoidant trap. They even have a name for this. However, if the partner who typically does the withdrawing suddenly turns around and begins to reciprocate affection, the chaser will most likely turn into the runner. That's right, even an anxious attacher can avoid intimacy with the same behaviors. Although it doesn't often happen with these people, because they won't suddenly turn around and reciprocate the affection when we need it. So this dance occurs because of the way each player deals with their emotions is both a threat and an attachment trigger to each other. And when that happens, it stimulates their wounded inner child, who then hijacks the relationship with emotional reactivity. The wounded child ends up steering the ship of the adult body. And of course, this is not healthy. We don't let children drive for a reason. I love this graphic. It helps demonstrate the avoidant relationship cycle. So if you start at the top, they're in a new relationship and this feels great. Next thing you know, as they begin to get a little bit closer, they start noticing some worrying things. And it starts to feel really intense. So I'm thinking I'm gonna leave. I feel trapped. I need space. They get their space. I can breathe now. Now I'm starting to feel lonely because I crave intimacy. So I wonder what they're up to. Maybe I made a mistake. I want someone to love me, but why can't I ever find the right person? And then they reestablish the connection and it goes around and around and around. So if you recognize that you've been in a relationship with a fearful avoidant, this little graphic here should have bells going off in your brain. At least for me, with the fearful avoidance that I've been with, like this is to a T. There's not even one piece that's missing from here. And it's so confusing to be on the receiving end of this, because during that new relationship and this feels great cycle part, you know, you feel like you're entering a great relationship. You feel like you're special to them. You feel like they're into you because they are into you. It's not fake. And then when all of their stuff gets triggered and they start pulling back, you feel like they're playing games with you, or maybe you start questioning, was that even real? There's so many things go through your head. And then finally, you probably are the one that ends up walking away and breaking up the relationship. So this is, then you become the one going away. And once they get that space that they need, they realize they miss you and they start pursuing you. And it's this cycle over and over again. And especially when they reestablish the connection, that reinforces our confirmation bias. Like it's just, oh my gosh, it's so convoluted and messy. But when that reconnection happens, it triggers you to think, oh, they really do love me. And that allows you to put in all of that work again, because you know deep down inside that person cares about you. And that's a real thing because they do care about you. But the part that's also real is that this is the cycle. This is the cycle with each one of these people. And it's sad. I kind of like to think that I would rather be an anxious attacher than a fearful avoidant, because they have the two biggest parts of the other two insecure attachment styles merged together, the avoidant and the fear. It's such a painful struggle for them that it sounds like torture to me. One guy that I dated that had this, literally had panic attacks. He would go to the ER a couple times a year thinking he was having a heart attack. And really it was this triggered attachment style was giving him a panic attack with chest pain and shortness of breath. All right, what does it feel like to date an anxious or avoidant partner? So this is a little bit of both. Oh, Kathy, do we have a question?
We have a couple of comments.
Mhm.
We have Carolyn who said, my wounded child is really bad at articulating how she's feeling. It makes a mess of things. This graphic, slide 7, hits the nail on the head.
Slide 7, hold on. Oh, this is slide 7. Yeah, doesn't it hit the nail on the head? And you can read, like, this is from our partner's wounded child point of view, right? This thing is like incredible. If you're in one of these relationships now, any of you, cut this out and keep it handy. right? So the next time you have conflict in the relationship, try to look at this and you can probably stick your finger on what part of the cycle that they're in. And by doing that, it helps you to take it less personally. Does it mean that you're instantly going to stop being attracted to these people? No. Eventually, in time, you will. The more work that you do on this, you will gradually begin to rewrite that part of your brain, and that familiarity is no longer going to be a turn on for you. I promise you that that is how it works. All right. This is the avoidant partner. So they don't appreciate you and take your generosity for granted. They show up with fireworks one day and then disappear without explanation the next. They can treat you like an intimate partner, but maybe they don't give you physical intimacy. Or the other way around, they might only be interested in sex and exclude you from other aspects of their lives. They might avoid labeling the relationship and makes you feel neurotic for needing it. That was a big one for me. It was like, yeah, I was in this 2-year relationship, but if you ask them, we weren't in a 2-year relationship. Maybe we dated for 6 weeks and then we just kind of clung to this awful dance for 2 years. Behaves in a needlessly secretive fashion, or maybe they ignore you for weeks and then text that they miss you at 2 in the morning. Now, are all of these required? No. You know, they might just do some and not others, but I guarantee you, if you are an anxious attacher, some of these sound familiar. So I'll just give you a minute to kind of absorb these. So I added this partially in case anybody signed up for this class by mistake and realized they weren't actually anxious, but maybe they dated somebody who was anxious, so it still would be helpful. But also so that we can do some, you know, part of owning our own piece to these relationships. So what does it feel like generally when someone's dating an anxious partner like us? Well, it might feel like we are intrusive and monitoring their every move, extremely demanding, and we never give them any space. Sensitive, taking everything personally and overanalyzing what they say. Interprets most situations negatively. Controlling and presses for too much, too fast. Disrespectful of your boundaries and need for space. Expects you to read their mind and explodes when you don't. Hot 1 minute and cold the next. And I don't know if you noticed, but some of these are similar to the slide that we just looked at, you know, the hot 1 minute and cold the next. It's just for different reasons. So the avoidant is being cold to make some space. Whereas usually the anxious one, if they're cold, it's because they're angry or they're hurt. And it's a punishing, punitive thing. So I'm hoping that some of you are finding some of these to be a little bit familiar in your own actions, because that is our point, right? Self-awareness. Protest behaviors. So an anxious avoidant relationship has intoxicating highs and intolerable lows, fueled by an insecure attachment dynamic. Both insecure attachment styles are trying to create a sense of security through controlling their external conditions. This extends to controlling the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of their partners. Anxious partners implement protest behaviors to try to establish or reestablish connection in an insecure relationship. So I'll give you some examples here. This is supposed to be a graphic. But it's not. So they might do excessive contact followed by punitive withdrawal. They might keep score in the relationship or act hostile. Various forms of emotional manipulation, which we kind of touched on in that first week, which is all, the over texting or trying to make them jealous or trying to act jealous, all in a way to get them to behave the way that we want them to behave. Avoidant partners, on the other hand, will exert a sense of control by practicing detachment and using deactivating strategies instead of protest strategies. These are attempts at avoiding the emotional intimacy which they both fear and crave. So this might include their words and their actions don't match up. For example, verbally expressing an avoidance of commitment, but acting committed, or vice versa. Focusing on their partner's flaws, that gives them a great excuse to leave or to blame the end of the relationship on that instead of their fear of intimacy. Pining for the one that got away rather than being fully present in the current relationship. The last fearful avoidant that I dated did this all the time. His girlfriend at one point had committed suicide, actually, which also contributed to his insecure attachment style. Of course, that's trauma. But he spent so much time, and they had broken up because of this behavior. And they broke up because he was so avoidant. And then she ended up committing suicide. And that's the woman that he focuses on all the time instead of focusing on the ones that he has. And it's super sad once I understood all of this and what was going on with him, and the thought that I actually thought I could change this behavior. Like, that goes way beyond what a girlfriend can do. And I wasn't even labeled a girlfriend. Avoiding emotional intimacy in a current relationship by avoiding labeling the relationship, for example. Like I just said, I was never considered a girlfriend to any of these guys. Hyper or hyposexuality. And this is a great graphic which displays the cycle of the anxious avoidant trap. So if you start at the top, the anxious gets close, and then that triggers the attachment response of the avoidant, who panics and runs away, which then triggers the attachment response of the anxious, who starts a fear-based argument, which triggers the avoidant even more, who avoids problem solving, even though they could, because they want to have this space. And then the anxious leaves. And you remember, we have that reconnection. We saw that whole cycle of this avoidant person. So once that ends, they have that brief reconciliation, and then they start all over again. And to sum it up, on that top left-hand corner, the anxious is considered too much, and the avoidant is considered not enough in each other's eyes. Tell me that this does not sound familiar. And that this is why we're all in this class, because we are sick and tired of being caught in this trap. Avoidant sex behaviors. Since we dug deep into the anxious attachers' sexual behavior, it's only fair to do the same with the avoidants. And both fearful avoidance and dismissive avoidance tend to share these behavior patterns. And it is possible for an anxious attacher to pair up with a dismissive avoidant for sure, but they don't last very long because the dismissive avoidant has no tolerance for clinginess. So it's a discomfort with sexual activities because they require intimacy. Less to no sexual activity, or emotion-free sex only. That's usually the most common one. You'll often find them even using prostitutes. One-night stands, those are very common. in order to satisfy their sexual needs, and it just takes emotions off of the table, which is perfect for them. That's what they want. Using sex to manipulate the partner or protect yourself from the partner's negative affect, to reduce stress, or to achieve high status among peers. Using sex to maximize control and emotional distance, not enjoying foreplay, pursuing non-committed or casual relationships, fantasizing about sex with someone other than your partner, having affairs and short-term sexual relationships, using fantasy as a substitute for intimacy. And this even starts in the teen years with a low perceived sex drive, self-enhancing motives for sex, and not enjoying intercourse. Are all of these 100% true for these people? No, but these are very common signs of avoidant attachment in bed. And to be on the receiving end of that when you really care about somebody and you have formed this attachment to them sucks. So I'm going to give you the homework now, and we'll have a few minutes to chat after with the self-reflection, because I want to be able to turn off the PowerPoint. So I want you at some point this week to review the slide on protest behaviors, because that's us. And as much as it's important to learn about everyone else, we're focusing on the one person in the relationship that we can change, and that's ourselves. So write down the ones that you use in relationships. And if you can come up with some that aren't on the list, write them down. Including examples, as much details as you can, because it's so important for us to recognize this, because we need to change this behavior. Review the slide on deactivating strategies. Think of times when your partner used them on you. How did it make you feel? What thoughts did you have about yourself during those times? And how did you respond? And think about all of those graphics that we have where we go around and around. And, are we textbook? You tell me next week. Next, where did you learn your protest behaviors from? Think back to your childhood. It might not be the exact same example, but something is going to feel familiar. Where did you learn to react to deactivating strategies? Again, think back to your childhood. For me, where did I learn to react from deactivating strategies? From my dad. What alternative behaviors and thought patterns would you like to see in yourself? So again, like last week, where you list the examples of what you are doing now, and then list what you would like to replace it with. Okay. And Kathy, we have something.
Yes, we have a couple of comments. Kate from a few slides back said, ugh, I know the situationship. Carolyn said, I get it. After 3.5 years, I learned was just a friend. And Karina just asked, which slide would you redisplay them?
I sure will, Karina. I don't know what number they are, so I gotta go back. I mean, honestly, all of them, but let's see. So these deactivating strategies are what our partners would typically do with us in relationships, okay? So their words and their actions don't match up. They might tell you they love you, they want to be with you, but then they avoid making plans with you. They might focus on your flaws or pining for the one that got away, or, and you might come up with some of your own, right? And the whole avoiding labeling the relationship, God, that's like such a huge one. And then the ones that, sorry, gotta go one at a time here. Protest behaviors. So these are the ones that we exhibit in order to establish or reestablish connection. So the excessive contact, remember I had in that first week, the multiple text messages, or, what's going on, taking things so personally and trying to get them jealous so that they will come after us, or maybe punishing them by not answering their text for a couple of days, even though that kills us to do so. So any type of manipulation or controlling behaviors, these are protest behaviors. You can also do a quick Google search if you feel like yours aren't really pinpointed in these few examples that I put here. There's a million examples out there. So you can Google protest behaviors and deactivating behaviors or strategies in attachment styles. All right, that was a lot, wasn't it? Well, let me read what I feel like I wanted to talk about. Self-reflection. There's just so much going on in these relationships. Impossible for us to cover it all in a 4-week course. It's just too much. This is a lifetime of us living this way. And there's so many variables and bits and pieces and stuff to figure out. So this is like a beginning overview for you guys, okay? And since you're in this class, I know that a lot of this is probably resonating with you, even if it's not all. And I know my mind is swirling right now, and I teach this stuff. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, it's okay. This course is designed to help get you on the right path. It's not designed to fix all of it in one class. And we're not going to get you to the finish line by next week either, but we're going to at least let you see where the finish line is. And so it's really important to give yourself a lot of grace while you're doing this work. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I think is the phrase. And remember the external resources that came with the course information, with the books. So let's reflect. Do you recognize your partners and what we learned about tonight? And more importantly, do you recognize yourself in anything that we talked about tonight? Do you see the patterns? We are still at the self-awareness stage of this course, but I want to open it up for discussion. And so instead of the breakout sessions tonight, we're just going to ask questions about what's confusing, or share our aha moments of tonight, which will kind of give other people here permission to share their aha moments. And the goal is to begin to identify what role you are playing in the relationship pattern. There's a reason you choose the mates you do. Have you made the connection yet? And do you recognize your own protest behaviors? And we want to learn what triggers us to behave that way. When I was reading some of this tonight, like, my wounded child is alive and well. We don't ever, we heal our wounded children, but we don't ever heal them completely. They're always part of us, and it's learning to recognize when our behavior is our wounded child and when it's our adult person. And that's kind of like an art form, trying to figure that out. And I recognize a lot of behaviors that I still do, and I'm teaching this class. So does anybody have any questions or comments, feedback on the things that we talked about tonight with the anxious avoidant trap? Read the chat real quick. Carolyn.
Yeah, so I was trying to be more, together about it when I learned this summer that I was just a friend after 3.5 years. And so, after, a few weeks of emotional turmoil, I was like, okay, let's go ahead. He said, if you want more, go find somebody else. And so I was like, okay. So I stopped being, I started to get my head into like, okay, I guess it's time to move on. Maybe we can still be friends, but so if I sort of withdraw because he said to, of course he came back as soon as I did, like, oh no, wait. But if I withdraw because he said to, is that still punitive withdrawal?
Not necessarily, no. The punitive one is if he said, we're just friends, and you withdraw as a way to manipulate him to come back to you,
Okay.
then
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
And
No,
maybe it's a little bit of both, you know, I mean, it's only you can answer that, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like I used to withdraw, like I have a specific person in mind when I give my examples. There's a couple that, all of them, almost all of them, my whole life are like this, but I think about the last one I was with just because it's the most fresh in my mind. And also I learned about attachment styles while I was with this guy, while I was hooked on him. I say while I was in this relationship, but we were not in a relationship at that point, but I
That's
felt
what I
like we
learned.
were. I
Yeah.
felt like we were, even though I knew we weren't, and he told me we weren't. I was in love with him. And I knew that he loved me and he just couldn't. And once I figured out this, I said, oh, it's his attachment style. And then I was hell bent on helping him heal his attachment style instead of being hell bent on healing mine. And it's once I shifted that focus to me. But I used to be punitive and like just not answer his texts or try to make him jealous by talking about other guy. Oh yeah, I am dating someone because we're just friends now, you know, let's be friends. And then, you know, talk about going out on my dates. I signed up for Match and all of this stuff and would tell him as a friend what I was doing, which is what he wanted me to do. That's what he said he wanted me to do. But I was doing it not necessarily just because he said it, because I was hoping it would make him realize what he was missing.
So I guess the difference is your motivation.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And your expectation. Right.
Mhm.
So yes, you're distancing yourself because he told you to, but how do you feel about that? Are you hoping that he'll come around? You know, you don't have to answer that right now, but like, you know, there's a lot of messy questions, like,
Yeah.
and you might feel differently from one day to the next, which makes this so freaking hard. You know, at one point I even told him, I said, I realize that I have an anxious attachment style and that you have this one. And I know that I want to work this shit out so that I don't go through the heartache of getting over you just to sign up for another version of you next year. You know, like, because I realize that's what I've been doing. And it always was heartache to get over these guys, because when you have that attachment and it's primal, you can't let go, right? You just like, at least for me, I could not sever the attachment. Even when they blatantly told me, we are just friends. Maybe we'll have sex sometimes, but we're just friends. That should make me walk away and not be attached to him. But I just could not, I was so hung up on him. There was no room for anybody else to come in my life. And it wasn't until I shifted the focus from changing his behavior to changing my own and realizing where it came from. And that actually involved doing a lot of inner child work with my therapist and nothing to do with relationships. And then I could start to slowly feel the shift. And eventually I honestly wasn't attracted to him anymore. So then the distancing was because I just wasn't interested. It wasn't me saying I was interested, but really faking it. You know, I was not interested. And if he had come back and chased me again, it's a turn off to me now, that type of behavior.
Mhm. Yeah.
So,
When I met this guy, it was just supposed to be a summer thing.
yeah.
I had been 6 months after a 6-year relationship, and I was like, oh, let's just have some fun for the summer. And he wasn't fully available. And to me, that was a feature, because I just wanted to have a summer fling. And that was going as planned until the pandemic. And honestly, I don't think I would have kept playing along if the pandemic hadn't happened. That changed a lot of things, right? Couldn't see anybody else, at least we already shared the same airspace, right?
Yeah.
And I think there was a point when I thought like, oh, well, this is different than I thought, but I did get attached, with the given time. And then when, he was like, no, we're just friends, I was like, oh, and I realized like, well, even if he changes his mind next week, he's not the kind of guy I'd want to be in a long-term relationship with. He was for fun. And so now it's like, oh, I don't necessarily need him to change. I think I just need to be like, okay, you're right. I do want something more, but that something more is not with you. So,
Well, that's great.
but then he's going to keep texting me.
Well, I mean, then you can look at your feelings and, and there's nothing black and white about this. Some of them are like the graphic of the cycle and everything. It's like, oh, that's spot on for most of us. But, I have to look at myself and sometimes wonder, have I swung the other way sometimes where I exhibit some avoidant behaviors? Or is that security? Like, it's sometimes it's difficult for me to determine, especially when it's myself, because it's really hard for us to see ourselves. And where I never had security in a relationship, it's sometimes difficult for me to differentiate exactly where I landed on this spectrum after doing the work. And have I stopped swinging that pendulum? Where is it going to go next as life goes on?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get that. There's definitely some things in my attempt to not be such an anxious attachment person, even though I'm just learning this vocabulary.
Yeah.
That I'm like, oh, well, now I'm doing this dismissive thing. I'm not going to have another relationship ever. I'm just going to be by myself and my dog and hang out with my girlfriends and just, but I know that's not really what I want.
Right. And we can certainly act that way when we're not in the relationship anymore. And then it's how do we act once we feel that chemistry again?
Mhm.
That will determine where you are on the spectrum.
Thanks.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm just reading the slides, which I think. Oh, you just asked me about that. All right. Anybody else have anything they want to share? Or are we feeling good? All right, guys. So we've got 1 week left next week where we start talking about healing the anxious attachment style, and then we'll be done. So you have your homework assignments, you have the PowerPoints. If you have any questions over the week, reach out to me on Facebook, text, or whatever, and I'm happy to answer. All right. Great to see you guys. Thank you, Kate. Bye.